Hey there. Tonight, we're pulling up a creaky wooden bench beneath a flickering torchlight where greasy fingers tear roasted meat from the bone and the air is thick with smoke, sweat, and something that might be cinnamon or just burning fat. Welcome to the medieval feast. You've heard of them, haven't you? Long wooden tables, overflowing trenchers, goblets of spiced wine, and roasted animals turning on spits. The kind of place you imagine would be fun for a night until you actually had to live through one. Now, dim the lights. Light a candle if you've got one. Or just let the gentle glow of your screen pull you in. Close your eyes. And slowly, let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. Congratulations, you've just been invited to a medieval feast. That means you're either rich, noble, or someone important's forgettable cousin. Either way, you're about to step through the towering oak doors of the Great Hall and instantly wish you hadn't, because the first thing to hit you isn't the sight of roast boar or twinkling candlelight. It's the smell. Oh, sweet saints above, the smell. Imagine a thick fog of humanity, unbathed bodies, damp wool, ancient ale spills, and the oily smoke of animal fat candles. Now stir in a generous dose of damp rushes on the floor that haven't been changed since the last feast, which may or may not have been during the previous plague. The tang of sour wine, and something you can only describe as meat ghost. Welcome to the sensory assault that is the medieval banquet hall. Hold your breath. It's not going to get better. You step onto the rush-covered floor, which is less decorative and more an attempt at indoor composting. These rushes are supposed to soak up spills and other things. But after a dozen nights of spilled ale, meat drippings, dog pee, and someone's dropped kidney pie, they've developed a character all their own. Every step squelches. You pretend not to notice. That's just part of the ambiance. Above your head, a canopy of wooden beams drips condensation. Or is it grease? Hard to tell. The walls are lined with ancient tapestries that may once have told glorious stories of knights and saints, but now mostly tell tales of mildew and moth infestation. The air is thick, humid, and somehow chewy. You find yourself blinking more than usual, unsure if it's from the candle smoke or the stench of mutton vapors fighting for dominance with someone's armpits. Your eyes finally adjust to the flickering glow of torches and tallow candles. Romantic? Perhaps, if you find smoky haze and soot stains on your best tunic charming. The candles burn low and stutter in the draft. There's always a draft. The hall might look grand from outside, but these stone walls are cold, damp, and about as windproof as a breadbasket. You suspect it's warmer outside, and it's January. Over in one corner, a man is playing the lute. Badly. A boy with a recorder joins in, summoning something that sounds like a goose being slowly stepped on. This is your entertainment. Try not to laugh too hard. It could be the Lord's nephew. People have been maimed for less. Meanwhile, the nobles are arriving. One by one, they strut in, layered in furs and jewels and perfumes, meant to battle their own body odor. The result? An olfactory war between unwashed limbs and floral desperation. Every time someone walks past, it's like inhaling a potpourri-laced slap in the face. You're praying for a breeze. There won't be one. You do your best not to look at the hounds. There are always hounds. They wander freely through the hall, licking scraps off the floor, growling at guests, and occasionally relieving themselves in corners. Everyone pretends not to notice. A lord's favorite hunting dog has more rights than you do. You give one a wide berth. He gives you a look that suggests he'd eat your leg if the main course disappoints. A servant stumbles past with a tray of something steaming. You hope it's food. You fear it might be a boiled badger. Either way, he drops some of it right onto the rushes, where it will mix with pig grease and ale until the next pestilence rolls through. The floor has its own ecosystem now. Someone sneezes nearby. It's not a dainty modern sneeze. It's a full-throated plague-era explosion that rattles his nose hairs and sprays several tables. No one flinches. There's no tissue. He wipes his hand on a sleeve and continues eating. You pretend you didn't see it. You wonder if it's too late to fake illness and leave, but then you remember. It's medieval Europe. Everyone is already ill. You stay. The Lord enters at last, to mild applause and intense sniffing. The musicians strike up something energetic that still sounds vaguely like a dying duck. You're jostled toward your assigned spot on the bench. There are no chairs, unless you're somebody who owns land, soldiers, or 3 or more hats. You sit, and your backside is instantly introduced to a splinter. There are no cushions. Your wooden seat is one of 20 in a row, and you're wedged between a large, sweating knight and someone who may be a monk, or possibly just very dirty. You fold your hands. You try to smile. The feast is about to begin. The host raises his goblet. The hall cheers. You try not to inhale. Because welcome to the medieval banquet hall. It is not glamorous. It is not clean. It is not even particularly safe, but it is alive with noise, smells, questionable hygiene, and the constant risk of gout. And you, lucky guest, have a front row seat. Just don't ask what's in the stew. Now, you've just been ushered into the heart of a medieval feast. The Great Hall. And by ushered, I mean you were shoved through an oak door the size of a ship's hull by a sweating servant who smells like fear, onions, and yesterday's goose grease. The good news? You're not stuck outside in the sleet. The bad news? Inside isn't much better. First thing you notice? It's freezing. The Great Hall is basically a stone barn with delusions of grandeur. There's no insulation, no glass windows, and certainly no concept of heating that doesn't involve setting something on fire. The walls are damp, drafty, and about as welcoming as the inside of a tomb. You can feel the cold creeping up your legs like a guilt-ridden ghost. The fire roaring at the far end looks warm, but unless you're seated next to it, and you aren't, you might as well be in Iceland. Now you'd think with all these people crammed into one room, body heat would help. It doesn't. Not when half the guests are armored, sweating and fanning themselves while the other half are peasants bundled in every scrap of wool they own, including their grandmother's socks. There's no central heating, just central suffering. As for the fire, it's more hazard than help. It's blazing in a stone hearth with no real barrier. Children run past it. Dogs nap too close to it. At least 3 guests have singed their robes tonight, and one unfortunate squire now smells like scorched lamb. If you want to warm your hands, you'll need to elbow through a thicket of sharp elbows, clanging goblets, and territorial nobles with bad tempers. Watch your sleeves. They catch easily. And fire-retardant fabric. doesn't exist yet. Neither does a fire brigade. Then there's the noise. You were expecting maybe lute music and polite applause? Wrong century. It's chaos. A band of musicians is crammed near the back, wailing on sackbuts, rebecks, and something that looks like a goat with strings. They're playing what can only be described as medieval dubstep. Loud, off-key, and entirely relentless. No one asks them to stop, and no one dares to. They're paid in bread and beer, and they take their jobs very seriously. The noise doesn't stop there. Lords bellow for more wine. Children shriek as they chase a terrified cat under the table. Someone's minstrel is yelling about a goose. There's coughing, barking, belching, and the occasional scream when someone realizes the meat still has feathers. Conversations have to be shouted or mime-acted over the cacophony, which leads to misunderstandings. Like the knight who thought he was being asked to pass the salt, but ended up proposing marriage. Your seat, by the way, is a splintered bench with the lumbar support of a plank and the softness of a rock. No cushions, no backrest. Just a communal plank next to a man whose breath smells like fermented eel, and whose concept of personal space died in the Crusades. The tables are just thick boards laid across barrels or trestles, wobbly, unstable. One wrong elbow, and your ale is in someone's lap, and that someone might be a baron with a very sharp dagger and a short temper. Above you, banners hang from the rafters, their dusty fabric swaying with the draft like tired flags in a war zone. And there are rafters, wooden beams blackened from decades of smoke, occasionally dripping with something you hope is just condensation. Rats live up there. You know this because one just ran along the beam and disappeared into the shadows. No one screams. No one even flinches. It's just part of the ambiance. Servants weave through the crowd, carrying trays overloaded with meats and jellies and puddings that jiggle ominously. They duck and dodge like dancers in a battlefield, because one wrong step, and they're wearing that boar's head instead of serving it. And if they drop something, well, it's the kitchen's fault, or the floor's fault, or your fault if you're within reach. Lighting? Minimal. The hall is dimly lit by sputtering torches and tallow candles that drip like melting goblins. The shadows do most of the decorating. You can't really see your food, which may be a blessing. Considering what's on the menu. Faces flicker in and out of view, giving the whole place the atmosphere of a haunted banquet. But the worst part? The layout. There's a strict social geography in the Great Hall. You don't just sit wherever you want. The higher your status, the closer you are to the fire, the host, and the good food. You, however, are halfway down the table next to a sweating monk who's been talking to his beer for the past 20 minutes. If you so much as glance at the upper table, you'll get side-eyed by someone in velvet and judgment. Step out of line, speak out of turn, or stand without permission, and you'll be noticed. And not in the good way. Lords and ladies watch everything. That drunk knight down the table, he's the Earl's cousin. That silent girl by the pillar, she's the king's niece. The dog under the table probably has a title. You're being evaluated constantly. And if you spill something, if you insult someone, if you reach for the wrong platter, it could mean no invite next time. Or worse. So, yes, you made it to the Great Hall. Congratulations. You're sitting in the cold, listening to what sounds like a dying goat orchestra, trying to chew with numb fingers and dodging open flames like you're in a culinary obstacle course. You're technically feasting. But you've never felt less comfortable, less warm, or more certain that you left your dignity back at the door, right next to that goose someone tripped over. And the feast hasn't even started yet. Now, you're probably thinking roasted chicken, warm bread, maybe a goblet of wine. Delightful. But here's the reality. You're crammed shoulder to shoulder on a splintery bench beside a man who hasn't bathed since the last harvest. And there it is, front and center on the banquet table. Half a pig's head staring at you like it knows your secrets. And not a clean, tidy cartoon pig either. We're talking jowls, snout, whiskers, the occasional ear hair, and teeth still intact. It's been roasted whole, probably with an apple shoved in its mouth for show, as if that makes it more dignified. The skin is waxy, the eyes are cloudy, and you could swear it just twitched. Welcome to fine dining, medieval style. The pig's head isn't even the weirdest thing you'll see tonight. Not by a long shot. If you're unlucky enough to be dining with nobility, expect peacocks. Yes, the pretty birds from fairy tales, roasted whole, then redressed in their own iridescent feathers and set upright like they're still alive. It's food, it's decoration, it's an existential crisis on a silver platter. Swans, too. Majestic, aggressive creatures turned into centerpieces and then consumed with a disturbing lack of irony. Presentation mattered more than palatability. The goal wasn't taste. It was status. You didn't serve peacock because it was delicious. You served it because it was rare, expensive, and looked absolutely unhinged sitting on the table in full plumage. Taste? Nobody cared. Most of these animals were tough, stringy, and gamey beyond recognition. But who would dare complain? That peacock cost more than your house. Back to the pig. You're staring at it. It's staring at you. There's a weird glaze on its face, thickened fat puddling at the bottom of the tray. And the smell? Oh, the smell is something between wood smoke, overcooked meat, and a faint but distinct barnyard note. A knight 2 seats down has already torn a cheek off and is now licking grease off his fingers like a barbarian at an all-you-can-eat nightmare. You reach for a piece because it's expected. You don't want to offend your host, who is rich, drunk, and armed. The meat is greasy and tepid. You chew. It's both chewy and mushy, somehow managing to feel raw and overdone at the same time. You smile. You nod. You lie through your teeth. Delicious. But don't look away just yet, because now the pig's skull is getting carved into with a dagger that probably pulled double duty as a letter opener and wart remover earlier in the day. The skull is split open, and someone starts scooping out the brain. They call it a delicacy. You call it your villain origin story. If you're a guest of lesser fortune, it might not be pig. Maybe it's a hare, presented in its fur for dramatic flair, meaning it's skinned except for the head and feet. The effect is ghastly. Or maybe it's a cow's tongue laid out like a wrinkled, overboiled shoe. If it came from a kitchen, it's going on the table, edible or not. Still hungry? Let's talk pies. Not dessert pies, not apple pies. We're talking meat pies, often with surprise contents. You might get a pigeon, you might get a frog. You might get a mixture of organs that someone swore was good luck. The crust is dense and dry, designed more to hold the contents than to be eaten. Sometimes, for show, they'd bake live birds into them so the pie would squawk when opened. It's fun until it's traumatizing. By now, the smells have mingled. Burnt fat, spiced sauces trying desperately to mask decay. The room is hot, loud and thick with human breath and animal grease. There's a dog circling under the table. You don't know whose it is. Maybe no one's. Maybe it just lives here now, feeding on scraps and haunting dreams. There's also a small boar, fully intact, lying across a tray like it fell asleep mid-charge. Apple in mouth. Again. Why do they keep doing that? Is it tradition? Is it irony? Is it just because it fits? And in the corner, a table with the good stuff. Maybe a roast deer, its antlers still attached. Maybe a goose so overspiced it smells more like perfume than food. Nobles love spices. Not because they understand seasoning. Oh no. But because spices are expensive. Cover a bad cut of meat in cinnamon and clove, and suddenly it's a showstopper. Or at least it smells like one. Tastes like regret. Let's not forget fish, not flaky fillets or lemon-kissed salmon. No, you get a whole pike staring into your soul, served cold and gelatinous. Or if it's a feast day, maybe something sacred like eel, boiled beyond recognition. All eyes, bones, and confusion. And yet, you eat because you're supposed to, because this is a celebration, because someone important invited you, and because saying no to the head of a roasted animal might get you banished or worse, publicly mocked. You chew. You sip your drink. You avoid eye contact with the centerpiece. You're not sure what you're digesting, but you are sure you'll never forget it. This is what dining means in 1325. Performative meat consumption, surrounded by noise, grease, and the very real chance of botulism. Enjoy your pig's head. You've earned it. And then you think to yourself, I need a drink, something refreshing. But no, that glass in front of you isn't filled with clean, sparkling water. It's ale, and you're about to find out why. Water in medieval Europe is a death lottery. It's not a refreshing sip from a mountain spring or a clean well. It's more like a swirling cauldron of disease and despair. Rivers, streams, wells. They're all suspect, carrying with them invisible killers that modern science would later name as cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and countless other plagues. But in 1325, nobody knows about germs or bacteria. They just know the water looks, smells, and tastes like a swampy cesspit. And more importantly, it makes you dread the next day. So what do? You drink ale, even the children, even the elderly. Ale is the universal beverage of choice because it's been boiled during brewing, a kind of medieval water purification, if you will. The brewing process kills most of the nasties, making it a safer option than water. But don't think this ale is like the chilled, crisp craft brews you enjoy today. No, this ale is weak, barely alcoholic, more like a hearty, slightly sour barley soup you can sip all day long without passing out. They called it small beer. Sometimes, and it was as essential to daily survival as bread. Picture this: every household, no matter how poor or rich, brewing their own ale or buying it from the local alewife. Ale was so common, it was basically the medieval equivalent of tap water. Farmers, nobles, monks, children, all guzzled it down with almost every meal. The saying went, drink ale and live hale, because if you didn't, well, you might just die from what lurked in the water. Wine, you say? Ah, yes. Wine was the fancy adult beverage, mostly reserved for the nobles, the clergy, or anyone who could afford expensive imports. It was served at grand feasts, but was a luxury for the average person, whose idea of a special drink was usually a stronger ale or mead. But for peasants and most townsfolk, ale was the drink of choice, the safest liquid available. Now don't picture yourself at the feast with a clear, clean-looking drink. Ale could be cloudy, brownish, and thick enough to need a good swirl. It was often served in wooden or ceramic mugs, not exactly pristine vessels, sometimes sticky with leftover residue from previous customers. The smell? Earthy, yeasty, sometimes sour. You'd get used to it, or you'd have no choice. Drinking ale constantly might sound like a drunkard's life, but it was a necessity. The water sources around you are contaminated in ways you can't see, but your body feels. There's no filtration system, no chemical treatment, just the ancient and often ignored wisdom that boiled barley and fermented grains make water less deadly. Here's the kicker. You don't just drink ale at meals, you drink it at breakfast. Yes, breakfast. Because a mug of ale in the morning gave you energy, kept you hydrated, sort of, and, most importantly, kept the waterborne illnesses at bay. Children would get their own weak ale, sometimes called small ale, to drink throughout the day. Yes, children. Don't imagine a toddler with a sippy cup of juice. Imagine a toddler clutching a wooden mug filled with weak, sour ale, because the alternatives were worse. But ale came with its own downsides. The weak alcohol content could make you drowsy or sluggish if you had too much, but most of the time, the ale was more about safety than intoxication. And since it was a basic staple, people developed a kind of tolerance. It's not the party drink. It's the survival drink. You might be wondering, didn't anyone just drink water? Sure, some brave souls tried, but the results were catastrophic. Medieval towns and villages were built right next to or above their waste streams. Yes, open sewers running through streets. Just below your feet, waste was dumped out of windows and onto the streets. Everything from human waste to animal droppings, leftover food, and whatever else people wanted gone. Rain washed all this into the wells and rivers where people got their water. So, every sip of water was basically a gamble with death. Outbreaks of diseases were common, and whole villages could be wiped out after a bad water season. Cholera and dysentery didn't just make you sick, they made you collapse in agony, sometimes within hours. So drinking ale? It was a safer bet. And yet, there were no alternatives. No bottled water, no indoor plumbing, no filter pitchers, just ale, and lots of it. Monasteries, some of the best educated places in medieval Europe, brewed ale not just for monks, but for travelers and the poor. Even royalty appreciated a good brew between the more sophisticated wines. Think about the social implications. The local alehouse wasn't just a pub. It was the hub of medieval life. Everyone gathered there to drink their daily ration of ale, share news, plan the harvest, and gossip. But it was also a place where tempers flared, debts were made, and sometimes fights broke out. Still, it was safer than drinking the river water that ran dark and thick just outside the door. As the feast continues, your mug is never empty. Servants refill it with frothy ale, the closest thing to hydration you have. It's an odd sensation, trying to quench your thirst with a drink that's warm, thick, and vaguely sour. But it's life or death. And let's not romanticize it too much. Ale brewing was a messy business. Sometimes the ale was infected with all kinds of unwelcome guests, mold, wild yeasts, and other weird microbes that made it taste terrible or even sickening. Some batches were downright dangerous, causing nausea and vomiting. But even that was considered better than the alternative. The relationship between medieval people and their ale was one of necessity, survival, and begrudging acceptance. You didn't drink ale for pleasure. You drank it to stay alive, to survive the invisible threats lurking in every well, stream, and rain puddle. So the next time you raise a glass of crisp, clean water or a cold beer, remember this. Medieval Europeans didn't have that luxury. They drank ale because water might kill them. And that's why at every feast, from the grandest castle to the humblest village hall, ale was king. And water? It was the enemy you avoided at all costs. You've survived the drafty hall, the goblet of questionably warm ale, and you've even managed to find a seat somewhere in the middle of the table. Not close enough to be important, but far enough not to be ignored. The good news? You're about to eat. The bad news? You have absolutely no idea how. Because there are no forks. Yes, you read that correctly. The utensil that helps you politely stab pasta or delicately lift salad leaves hasn't been invented yet in most parts of Europe, or at least, it hasn't caught on. It exists in theory, somewhere in Byzantium maybe. But here in your Lord's Hall in 1325, forks are still seen as decadent, suspicious, or downright sinful. Some clergy say they look like miniature pitchforks, devilish tools, unfit for a good Christian hand. So instead of forks, you get fingers, and sometimes a knife, if you're lucky. But mostly, just fingers. So now you sit at a long wooden table, shoulder to shoulder with other guests, staring down at a communal bowl of something suspiciously brown and steaming. You are expected to share this dish with at least 2 strangers, maybe 3, depending on the size of the trenchers and the mood of the host. You look around. No napkins, no spoons, just everyone. Reaching in, greasy hands, double dips, slurping. There's a specific etiquette to this chaos, of course. You can't just grab and gnaw like a starving ferret. No, you must tear, not bite. If a chunk of meat is served, say a goose leg or some slightly suspicious pork, you must tear it gently apart with your hands. If it's too tough, you can use your eating knife, but only yours. Never grab someone else's. That's not just rude. It might get you stabbed. And the danger of offending your fellow diners. Accidentally take a piece too large? You're greedy. Tear something too loudly? You're uncouth. Lick your fingers before reaching back into the bowl? You're practically declaring war. And heaven forbid you spill something on the noble to your left, especially if he's a knight, especially if he's drinking. You try to manage your portion without attracting too much attention, but your hands are now covered in a thick layer of grease. That poultry was roasted in lard, and it shows. Your fingers glisten like candlesticks. There's no napkin in sight, just the hem of your tunic, and you don't dare wipe there because someone might notice. So you pretend this is fine, that you're fine. That sticky, roasted animal sweat is what you meant to wear to dinner. You glance around to see how others are managing. One woman, clearly a noble, elegantly pinches her meat with her fingertips and tilts her head like it's a court performance. A young page tries to use his dagger to slice something too fast and sends it flying across the table. It lands in the lap of a cleric who mutters something unholy and glares. The host laughs. You're not sure if it's directed at the boy or if it's the ale talking. Either way, nobody seems too horrified. This is, after all, just how it goes. Still, you start to notice things. People sucking on their fingers audibly, someone coughing into the communal bowl. A burly man across the table grabs a goose wing and bites into it with a crunch so loud you swear it echoes. He smiles at you with grease lining his beard. You smile back and consider dying. Oh, and don't even think about wiping your hands on the tablecloth. That isn't what it's for. That lovely woven fabric draped across the table? Purely decorative. You'd have better luck drying your hands on your own hair. Which, for some, is exactly what happens. The longer you sit, the more you realize the only real rule of feasting is, do not insult anyone more important than you. If a baron drops a slice of duck into the gravy, retrieves it with his fingers, and shoves it into his mouth like a starving wolf, you smile and nod. If a knight belches so loudly the candles flicker, compliment his virility. Meanwhile, your own stomach is torn between hunger and horror. The food smells good enough, if you ignore the undercurrent of boiled onions and something metallic, but your appetite is struggling against the logistics. Your hands are shiny. You've lost count of how many fingers have touched that gravy. You're fairly sure someone sneezed in it. And you're not done. More dishes are coming. A servant staggers by carrying a wooden platter piled high with what looks like ribs. He lowers it onto the table with a grunt, and the crowd leans in like dogs at a butcher's gate. It's every man and woman for themselves now. You watch as fingers dart in, as meat is torn, sucked, shared, hoarded. There's a rhythm to it. Primal, greasy, weirdly elegant. Somewhere, someone has dropped something on the floor. They retrieve it, blow on it like that will help, and pop it back into their mouth. You make a mental note never to trust your immune system again. But somehow, despite the shared bowls, the missing utensils, the ever-present sense that you're one poorly aimed gob of gravy away from social exile, you're surviving. You're eating. You're doing it the medieval way. With one hand, a dull knife, and a prayer. And just when you think you've gotten the hang of it, just when you've mastered the art of politely tearing meat with 3 fingers and an apologetic smile, someone asks if you'd like to try the eel pudding. You nod, but you didn't know things can and will get worse. Now, you've just been handed a plate, except it's not porcelain, or metal, or even wood. It's bread. A rock-hard, weeks-old, crusty, grease-absorbent slab of misery called a trencher. Bon appetit. See, in medieval times, the concept of dishware was more of a suggestion than a standard. Plates were expensive, hard to clean, easily breakable. So, the culinary genius of the day thought, why not just eat off a big hunk of stale bread? That way, when you're done, you don't need to do dishes. You can just eat the plate. Or more likely, give it to someone you don't like. Trenchers were sliced thick from loaves baked not for taste, but for durability. These weren't your soft sourdoughs or fluffy baguettes. These were more like medieval roof tiles. They were dense, chewy, and drier than a friar's sermon. By the time your meal hit the table, that trencher had already lived several lives, baked, hardened, stacked in a damp pantry, maybe repurposed as a rat deterrent, then finally slapped onto the table as your dining surface. And once food was ladled on top, greasy meats, questionable stews, unidentifiable lumpy pottage, the trencher began its next job. Sponge. It absorbed every drop of meat juice, sticky fat, and runny gravy, until it resembled a moist, meaty sponge cake that no one wanted to admit existed. It smelled like regret, and if you tapped it, it might moo. Now, you might be wondering, did people actually eat these trenchers? Great question. The answer is, sort of. If you were rich, noble, or simply had enough teeth left to bite through turkey bones, then no, you didn't eat your trencher. That was beneath you, figuratively and literally. Eating the trencher was a bit like licking the plate clean at a fine restaurant, frowned upon, unless you were starving, insane, or French. But someone would eat it, because after the feast, servants would collect the soaked, sagging trenchers and redistribute them to the poor. Yes, your discarded gravy bread became a charitable donation, a soggy surprise for the peasants who waited outside the feast hall like medieval DoorDash, hoping for leftovers that hadn't been sneezed on too aggressively. And while it may sound generous, this wasn't out of kindness. It was more about appearing pious. Nobles loved being seen as charitable, especially if it involved handing someone a plateful of grease-logged yeast sponge. Nothing says Christian humility like, "Here's the bread I just dripped boar fat onto for 3 hours." But wait, let's rewind to the actual moment you get your trencher. You're seated at the trestle table, a long, shaky plank balanced on barrels or folding stands, and in front of you is your edible plate. You're excited, hungry, slightly confused because you were hoping for an actual plate. Then comes the first course, splashed on top of it like Jackson Pollock with gravy. Maybe a stew, maybe a goose liver pudding, maybe something that still moves. All of it lands with a squelch. You try to cut your food, but your knife keeps sinking into the bread below. Now your trencher is bleeding meat juice. You take a bite of mutton and accidentally get a mouthful of bread that tastes like old socks. You tell yourself it's fine. It's rustic. It's traditional. You're lying. Around you, the air is filled with the sounds of chewing, slurping, burping, and the occasional thud of someone passing out into their trencher after too much mead. Servants hover like vultures, waiting to snatch away the soggy bread once the next course arrives. You consider defending your trencher? You might eat it, after all, but they move fast. One moment it's there, next moment it's gone, whisked off to the alley where beggars wait with wooden spoons and low expectations. And here's the kicker. Even those folks didn't always eat it, because sometimes trenchers went not to people, but to pigs. That's right. The social pecking order went: lords eat meat off bread, servants collect bread, pigs eat bread, beggars eat what pigs reject. So you, sitting at a lavish table inside a candlelit hall full of drunk nobles and sour meats, are dining from the future pig bucket. Enjoy your heritage. Of course, there were variations. Some trenchers were made of rye. Some used a coarse barley mix. Some were soaked in wine before serving to soften them, which sounds fancy, until you realize it just made the bread disintegrate faster under hot meat. And the mold, oh yes, let's not forget that medieval bread, when stored improperly, and it was always stored improperly, often developed a charming blue-green fuzz. If you were lucky, they scraped it off. If not, well, penicillin hadn't been invented yet, but accidental mycotoxins certainly had. You sit there chewing a crust that tastes faintly of mildew and animal grease, trying to keep your manners in check. Spitting it out would be rude. Complaining would be ruder. So you do what every medieval guest did. Nod politely, take a sip of weak ale to wash it down, and hope no one notices your soul leaving your body. So yes, the bread was a plate, but it was also a statement, a status symbol, a culinary afterthought, a receptacle of regrets, and no matter what you do, by the end of the night, some poor soul, or pig, will end up choking it down. And now that you know what's under your food, it's time to focus on what the food actually is. Spoiler, it's not going to get better. But hey, at least you're not the one licking the trencher in the alley. Welcome to the feast. You've made your bread, and now everyone else gets to eat it. Now brace yourself, because what you're about to eat might make you question every culinary decision you've ever made. And don't fool yourself into thinking this only happened to peasants. Oh no. Kings, queens, dukes, and duchesses were all dining on meals so questionable you'd spend the entire night guessing what you just ate. Spoiler alert, you probably never really knew. Let's start with the basics. Medieval kitchens had no refrigerators, no freezers, no hygiene standards we'd recognize today. Food preservation was a dark art of heavy spices, thick sauces, and cunning disguises. If your meal smelled or looked off, the answer wasn't throw it away. It was hide it under enough pepper, cloves, or saffron that no one can tell. That's right. Spices were the medieval version of a culinary invisibility cloak. They masked everything, from fish that had been left out too long, to meat that had turned questionable somewhere along the supply chain. And when I say spices, I don't mean a pinch of salt and pepper like you do at home. No, I'm talking about lavish piles of cinnamon, mace, nutmeg, ginger, and even sugar, the latter being an exotic luxury itself, smuggled from distant lands. This wasn't just a flavor choice, it was a survival tactic. The stronger and more expensive the spices, the better they masked the stench of decay. Sometimes dishes were so heavily spiced you might as well have been eating a perfume bottle. You'd think the royals would be spared this culinary roulette, but no. The upper classes had the same problem, maybe worse. You see, having a royal banquet was as much about show as it was about sustenance. Presentation mattered more than clarity. A dish might be stuffed with eels, porpoise, lampreys, or even mysterious meat pies with surprises that could turn your stomach. What exactly lurked inside those crusty pastry shells? Nobody was quite sure, and that was part of the fun, or horror. Lampreys, a type of jawless fish, were a royal delicacy. Fancy, slimy, and utterly revolting by modern standards, these creatures were prized for their texture and refined flavor. They'd be boiled, roasted, or baked into pies, and drenched in thick sauces made from wine, vinegar, and spices. But here's the catch. Lampreys were scavengers. They fed off dead animals in rivers and lakes, meaning what you were eating might have come from a murky stew of medieval river muck. Yum. But wait, it gets better. Eels, slippery and writhing, were served live in some feasts. These slippery creatures were considered luxury food and often cooked in a broth of wine and spices. Porpoise meat also occasionally appeared on the banquet table. Yes, the same sea mammal that today might evoke pictures of adorable ocean life was once grilled and served with the finest sauces. It was supposedly a delicacy reserved for the noble palate, though probably just another questionably fresh protein to the medieval diner. Now, about those pies with hidden surprises. Medieval cooks loved to cram all sorts of bizarre ingredients into a pie crust. Sometimes this was a practical way to use leftovers or parts of animals that wouldn't make it onto the plate on their own. Think offal, heads, or even brains. These pies were sealed tight, often without much regard for hygiene or freshness. Once baked, the crust was so thick and hard, it doubled as a plate. People would cut into it with their knives and dig out whatever mystery meat or fish lurked inside. So what was it like to actually eat this stuff? Well, imagine the feast is a grand event, long tables groaning under the weight of dishes that look more like art installations than food. Birds stuffed with fruits and nuts, pies carved into shapes of castles or beasts, and platters of roasted meats glazed in honey and spices. The aroma alone was overwhelming, a mixture of smoke, burnt fat, herbs, and that indefinable medieval funk that you never quite escape. The smell alone might have told you to run, but here you were, knife and fork in hand. Well, usually your fingers, since forks were rare, ready to gamble on what's on your plate. You take a bite, chew thoughtfully, and start the game of, what am I eating? Is this beef, mutton, or some unfortunate animal's tongue? Was that sweet or savory? The spices are so heavy, you can barely tell. Some dishes were intentionally ambiguous. The more elaborate the feast, the more layers of sauces and stuffing were used to disguise the quality of the meat. In fact, the fancier the feast, the more likely you were eating something that wasn't exactly fresh. No wonder it took hours of feasting and nearly as many glasses of wine or ale to wash it all down. And don't even get me started on sugar. Today, we think of sugar as dessert decoration or something you add to coffee. In medieval times, it was an expensive and precious commodity. The elite used it not just to sweeten dishes, but to mask unpleasant flavors. Meat was often caramelized with sugar or drizzled with honey to hide the smell of spoilage. That sticky sweetness mixed with spices was supposed to impress guests and show off wealth, because nothing says, "I'm rich," like dumping exotic ingredients on a piece of questionable meat to trick your guests into thinking it's delicious. But the most bizarre of all were the subtle dishes designed to shock or amuse. For example, some feasts featured jellies or aspics made from boiled animal parts, like pig's feet, or calves' heads set into savory gelatin. They looked fancy on the platter, but tasted like, well, boiled mystery. Some feasts even boasted dishes that contained live animals, frogs or birds, sometimes hidden inside pies. So when the pie was cut open, the poor creature would hop or fly out, much to the astonishment and horror of guests. Presentation was a spectacle in itself. Feasts were theatrical, often lasting for hours or days. The goal was to stun your guests with visual displays: roasted peacocks with feathers reattached, swans served in their own plumage, or pies carved into shapes of castles and animals. The food might have been questionable, but the spectacle was unforgettable. It was less about nourishment and more about power, wealth, and prestige. even if you had to choke down some mystery meat to keep up appearances. So, while you might have arrived hoping for a pleasant meal to recharge your medieval batteries, you were instead subjected to a guessing game of what lurked beneath those heavy sauces and crusts. You spent the night debating if that sweet spiced bite was veal or something far less appetizing, and if you were unlucky, that questionable meal could leave you sick or worse, because food poisoning was the unwanted guest at every feast, no matter how fancy. In the end, the food at a medieval feast was a paradox, lavish and decadent, yet often spoiled or disguised. A feast was a chance to display wealth and power, but also a gamble with your stomach and your health. You'd leave with a full belly, sure, but also with a lingering question. What exactly did I just eat? Welcome to the medieval banquet, where even the richest weren't spared from questionable cuisine, and every bite was an adventure in disguise. The long-awaited gathering, where everyone from lords to lowly servants cram into one big, noisy hall filled with food, drink, and entertainment. But hold on to your goblet, because the entertainment? It wasn't your modern-day circus or polite tavern music. No, the performances were wild, bizarre, and sometimes outright dangerous for both performers and audience alike. First off, let's talk about the sword jugglers. Yes, you heard that right. Men who tossed and caught gleaming blades as if they were mere apples. Now, imagine you're in a crowded hall, maybe a bit too close, and one of those blades slips. The performers didn't have fancy safety nets or spotters back then. One wrong move, and the show turned into an impromptu medical emergency. In fact, records from some feasts mention jugglers who lost fingers, or worse, fell on their own swords during a particularly ambitious stunt. You can bet that made the crowd gasp, and maybe even cheer at the drama of it all. Then there were the live animal acts. You might think, oh, some cute puppies or birds. Ha! Think bigger, weirder, and definitely more dangerous. Wild animals like bears, boars, or even wolves could be part of the spectacle. Imagine a bear, chained but still fierce, lumbering around the hall while a tamer tries desperately to keep control. Sometimes these animals would break free or snap unexpectedly. One famous incident involves a nobleman's prized hawk that managed to dive bomb a crowd, sending guests scrambling under tables, feathers flying everywhere. It wasn't just a show. It was chaos with claws and teeth. Speaking of chaos, there were also men who specialized in fire eating and flame breathing. The medieval equivalent of a modern fire juggler, but with less in the way of safety regulations. If you were unlucky enough to be near one who messed up, you might see singed eyebrows, or worse, a few bald spots on the heads of nearby spectators. If the fire didn't get you, the panic that followed often did, as the smoke filled the packed hall and people rushed for fresh air. And then, of course, there were the clowns. But don't picture colorful circus clowns making balloon animals and honking horns. Medieval clowns, or fools, were a whole different breed. Their job was to insult, mock, and sometimes outright offend everyone from peasants to princes, all while wearing jester hats and bells. The joke was on you, whether you liked it or not. These fools could push the limits of acceptable behavior, often teetering dangerously close to treason. Some jesters were known to mock the king so harshly that they found themselves in the stocks, or worse, their heads on a chopping block. But what made jesters fascinating was their unique privilege. Protected by their role as entertainers, they were allowed to say things others dared not. Think of them as the medieval version of a brutally honest Twitter feed. Their insults could slice deeper than any sword, and their jokes could undermine powerful men. Yet, they somehow survived because humor was a necessary release in a brutal world, and because kings needed someone to laugh with and at. That said, if you were a guest and the jester decided you were the butt of the joke, expect no mercy. It was like public humiliation served with a side of irony. Moving on to the more physical performances, consider the acrobats and tumblers who entertained the crowd with flips and balances that would make your modern-day gymnast proud. But the floors of these halls were often uneven, strewn with straw, spilled ale, and the occasional bit of dropped food. Not the safest environment for anyone doing backflips over a table. It was common to hear gasps followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the floor. Some performers carried scars and broken bones as badges of honor. No health insurance here. The strangest acts often came in the form of fool's plays, little theatrical sketches that mixed comedy, tragedy, and sometimes grotesque humor. Actors might dress as animals, demons, or mythological creatures, performing stories that ranged from the silly to the downright disturbing. Since many feasts were held in religious times, these plays sometimes skirted the edges of what the church allowed. Imagine a troupe acting out a bawdy story about a saint or a noble's folly. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a test of your ability to laugh at yourself and the world around you, or risk being shushed by the local priest. For the brave or foolhardy, there were even demonstrations of martial performances, knights clashing swords in mock battles, or wrestlers grappling with each other to the amusement, and sometimes horror, of the crowd. But unlike modern staged fights, these could get rough. Broken noses, bruised ribs, and even deaths were not unheard of. After all, these were men practicing real fighting techniques, not choreographed dance moves. One particularly grim form of entertainment sometimes included public punishments or executions. Now, you might wonder why anyone would want to witness such horrors. But in medieval times, these events were part justice, part spectacle, and part warning. If a criminal was brought out during the feast, their fate became entertainment for the crowd. Whether it was a whipping, a public shaming, or even a more severe sentence, it was all part of the feast atmosphere. The line between merriment and morbidity was razor thin. And if you were a guest with a weak stomach, the constant noise, flashing swords, roaring animals, and wild performers could be overwhelming. Imagine the smell, sweat, smoke, spilled ale, and animal musk, all mixing together to create a pungent haze. The noise of laughter, screams, music, and shouting layered over each other in a chaotic symphony that made it nearly impossible to relax. No wonder so many feast-goers ended the night with headaches or worse. By now, you're probably wondering if any of this sounds safe or even remotely pleasant. The answer? Not really. Medieval feast entertainment was a wild ride, thrilling and dangerous in equal measure. For every laugh, there was a potential injury. For every cheer, a risk of disaster. But that was part of the charm and terror of it. People craved excitement and distraction in a harsh world, even if it meant risking a cracked skull or a lost finger. So, if you ever find yourself magically transported to a medieval feast, keep your wits about you. Watch the sword jugglers with respect and a little fear. Steer clear of the wild animals, and don't be too close when the fire eaters light up their torches. And whatever you do, don't become the next victim of the jester's cruel wit or a clumsy acrobat's fall. Because while the feast might have looked grand from the outside, with its glittering goblets and towering plates of meat, the entertainment lurking behind the scenes was wild, bizarre, and sometimes fatal. The tables are groaning with food, the wines flowing like a river, and somewhere nearby, a jester is sharpening his wit. But beware, the jester isn't just there for laughs. He's smarter and far more dangerous than you probably imagine. You think jesters were just silly clowns in bright clothes? A harmless distraction while nobles stuffed their faces? Think again. Jesters were the medieval version of a political razor blade wrapped in a colorful hat. They were entertainers, yes, but also sharp observers, social commentators, and sometimes unofficial truth-tellers in a world where saying the wrong thing could get your head chopped off. First, let's talk about their outfit, because it tells you everything. That patchwork, bell-adorned costume wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a license to insult. When you see a jester prancing around with a floppy hat topped with bells, it means one thing. They're allowed to say the unsayable. Nobles couldn't throw shade at each other openly without risking a duel or a scandal. Jesters? They got to mock the king himself and survive. That's right. Medieval courts had rules, harsh ones. Say the wrong thing to a lord or lady, and you might be exiled, jailed, or worse. But jesters? They had a kind of royal immunity, a protected status. It wasn't that the king loved jokes more than law. It was that jesters had a useful job, keeping the court honest in their own way. Their barbs could expose corruption, bad decisions, or foolish pride, all wrapped in a joke or a song. Imagine sitting at a grand table, goblet in hand, when the jester suddenly points at you, grinning wide, and sings a bawdy tune about your terrible haircut, your questionable dancing skills, or your even more questionable lineage. Everyone laughs. You laugh. But inside, you're sweating. Because in the medieval court, embarrassment isn't just social discomfort. It can be political death. The jester's insults were rarely random. They were carefully crafted darts. A joke about your slow wit? Maybe a reminder you just lost favor with the queen. A quip about your family's debts? A subtle warning you're being watched. Jesters could make or break reputations in a single, well-timed insult. You never knew if you were laughing with them or at your own impending downfall. And they didn't just insult nobles. Sometimes the jester's sharp tongue targeted powerful courtiers, ambitious advisors, or even the king's closest friends. Those cracks could stir tension or even outright conflict. A bad night for the jester might end with a quick trip to the stocks or a close call with the executioner's axe. But the clever ones, they learned how to survive by being just offensive enough to amuse, but never quite enough to truly anger. It wasn't just words either. Jesters were masters of physical comedy, music, and storytelling. They juggle, dance, imitate, and improvise scenes that poked fun at the court's excesses or the king's mistakes. Imagine a man in bells miming a fat noble stuck in his chair after too many pies, or a woman dressed as a cranky duchess complaining about her ridiculous hat. These performances were more than entertainment. They were court gossip, social critique, and political theater all rolled into one. But here's the real kicker. The jester's role was dangerously close to treason. In fact, jesters often walked a tightrope. Say too little, and they're boring. Say too much, and they're executed. Some jesters use their position to gather secrets, spying for other nobles, or even foreign courts. A clever jester could pass coded messages hidden inside jokes or songs. Kings and queens knew this too. They often kept their jesters close, not just for amusement, but as a kind of informal advisor. The jester could say truths the king wouldn't hear from his loyal knights or sycophants. A clever king listened to his jester because sometimes jokes are the only way to soften hard truths. But this was a dangerous game. If the jester crossed the line or the king's mood turned dark, those bells could jingle their last tune. And what about the jester's origins? Contrary to popular belief, many were not simpletons or outcasts, but highly educated, talented individuals. Some had backgrounds in law, theology, or music. Their humor wasn't childish. It was layered, often relying on clever wordplay, satire, and deep knowledge of court politics and history. They were the medieval equivalent of today's political cartoonists, late-night comedians, or stand-up stars. Only their stage was a dangerous court, and their jokes had life or death stakes. Now, imagine you're a guest at that feast. You think you're here just to enjoy the food and wine, but the jester's eyes are on you. That sly grin, the pointed rhyme he's crafting behind his hand. He might be sizing you up, deciding if you're worth a cutting joke or a warning to others. Maybe you've just made a social faux pas, stepping on the wrong noble's toes in dance or spilling a drink, and the jester's ready to remind everyone of your blunder. If you're lucky, you'll be the target of a light-hearted jest, one that leaves everyone chuckling and you nursing bruised pride. But if you're unlucky, that joke might highlight your failures, greed, or secrets. And remember, medieval news travels fast. The court is a gossip engine, and the jester fuels it. So next time you think jesters were just buffoons, remember this: they were clever, dangerous, and had a power that few others in the court possessed. They were the only people allowed to laugh at the king and live to tell the tale. Their jokes were shields and swords, tools to survive and influence in a brutal, complicated world. In the end, if you ever find yourself at a medieval feast, keep your wits about you. Watch the jester closely, because when he laughs, it might not be at you. It might be at the entire court. And in that laughter, the truth you least want to hear. The fire blazes, the meat steams, the ale flows like a suspiciously warm river, and, good news, you've managed to sit next to someone who doesn't smell like they wrestled a pig on the way here. But before you lean back and pretend you're not freezing in that itchy wool tunic, let's play a little game called Who at this table wants to ruin your life? The answer? Potentially everyone. Because in medieval times, a feast wasn't just about food. It was a chessboard with too many knights, one jester, and absolutely no one playing fair. That cheerful servant refilling your goblet might be listening in. The monk who just asked about your cousin's dowry, definitely taking mental notes. The guy in the corner pretending to do magic tricks with apples might be a hired snoop with surprisingly good sleight of hand and a direct pipeline to your worst enemy. Welcome to the dinner party surveillance state. Here's the thing. Medieval politics didn't happen in smoky halls with solemn treaties and wax seals. They happened in full view, between sips of wine and passive-aggressive compliments. The feast was your stage. And if you said the wrong thing or looked at someone's wife for 2 seconds too long, your goose wasn't just cooked. It was plucked, stuffed, and roasted on the social bonfire. Nobles weren't stupid. Paranoid, yes. Stupid, no. They knew that a feast brought everyone together. Friends, enemies, cousins who were both. And when that many egos crammed into one hall, secrets were bound to spill. That's why people brought their own spies. Servants were the top pick, of course. They carried trays, poured wine, and lingered long enough to hear everything from whispers of rebellion to whether Lady Margot's dress was last year's fabric. Scandalous. Sometimes it wasn't even that subtle. Kings would plant entertainers. The court jester, supposed to make everyone laugh, right? Sure. But also, he's watching, listening, jotting down notes in his head while juggling turnips. Court jesters weren't just funny hats and bad puns. They were human wiretaps. They moved between tables freely, popped in on private conversations, and had the royal ear by dessert. Laughed too hard at the wrong joke. And congratulations, you just confessed to treason in front of an informant with a bell on his hat. And let's not forget the spies you invited yourself. Because even you, yes, even you, might need an ear at the feast. Maybe you're a middling knight trying to figure out who's aligned with whom, or a merchant hoping to sell overpriced spices to the lord of exactly where is that again. You send your manservant in early. He lingers near the kitchen, listens at doors, then reports back on who's sitting next to the host and which bannermen are getting more than their fair share of goose legs. This is reconnaissance. This is survival. This is dinner. Now, if you were really serious about your espionage, you'd bribe the kitchen staff. Why? Because everyone passed through that corridor of screams, smoke, and slightly charred poultry. Kitchens were chaos, yes, but also information hubs. Gossip flowed faster than the gravy. Who arrived late? Who's arguing in the garden? Which dishes were poisoned? Just kidding, maybe. If something important happened during the feast, the kitchen knew first. But you know who really knew everything? The wine steward. Yes, the guy in charge of the wine had power far beyond his corkscrew. Why? Because people talked when they were tipsy, and in the 14th century, people got very tipsy. No one trusted water, remember? It was basically a medieval game of intestinal roulette. So everyone drank wine, ale, or mead, even the kids. And once the wine steward knew who liked to talk a little too much after their third cup, he could casually lean in, top them off, and wait for the juicy details to spill out along with the dribble down their chins. Sometimes it wasn't even a person doing the spying. It was the architecture. Castles had secret passageways, little tunnels and peepholes built right into the walls. You thought the drapery fluttered because of a breeze? No, that was a scribe hiding behind the tapestry, jotting down your boast about how the Duke of North Nowhere can't hold his wine. Say hello to your new reputation as a gossiping drunk. Hope it was worth the extra leg of lamb? The worst part? You couldn't trust anyone. Not your table mate, not your servant, not even your cousin who you think likes you. But once asked if your mother's birth records were official, Feasts were social combat with trenchers instead of swords. Every smile hid a motive. Every toast was a test. Say too little, you're a snob. Say too much, you're a liability. And heaven help you if you caught the host's eye. That was a whole different game. If the lord of the manor leaned in to ask what you thought of the new tax on barley, don't answer. It's a trap. Whatever you say will be repeated, twisted, misquoted, and probably embroidered into a tapestry showing you as the town's most boring revolutionary. Your best bet? Laugh awkwardly, pretend to choke on your roast swan, and excuse yourself to the chamber pot. So yes, the food might be decent. The minstrels might hit the right notes. The tapestries might impress your date. But don't be fooled. Behind the roasted boar and polite clapping, there's a war of words, whispers, and wandering eyes. And if you're not careful, the feast won't just feed you, it'll finish you. Because in medieval Europe, the walls had ears, the servants had agendas, and the jester had better intel than the king's council. Bon appetit. You sit down, maybe near someone important, and just as you reach for your cup, disaster strikes. Your elbow catches the nearest goblet, and a rich splash of red wine arcs through the air, landing squarely on the lap of the lord's nephew. Now, this isn't just any spilled drink at any party. This is a medieval feast, where wine isn't just a drink, it's a symbol of status, wealth, and honor. And you, dear guest, have just committed a grave offense. In medieval society, hierarchy is everything. It's a delicate dance of power and respect, where every glance, every word, every movement can mean life or death. The feasts themselves were more than celebrations. They were political battlegrounds disguised as dinners. Everyone knew their place. And crossing the wrong person wasn't just embarrassing. It could be fatal. Picture this. The lord's nephew, still clutching his cup, looks down at his now stained velvet doublet. Velvet, mind you, a luxury that only nobles and the very wealthy could afford. That wine isn't just ruining his clothes. It's an insult to his family, his pride, his entire existence. His face darkens, and you feel the weight of 1,000 eyes drilling into your back. You try to apologize, hands raised and voice trembling, but medieval manners weren't quite like ours. Saying sorry might not be enough. If the lord's nephew is feeling particularly proud or reckless, as noble youths often were, he might challenge you to a duel on the spot. Or worse, call his friends to deal with you in less honorable ways. Because yes, duels did happen over spilled drinks. It sounds insane, but in the medieval code of honor, reputation was the currency of power. A careless spill was a sign of disrespect, and disrespect demanded retribution. You could find yourself in a dusty field the next morning, swords drawn, while a crowd watches to see if you'll live or die over a splash of fermented grape juice. And what if you're a commoner, sitting at the wrong table? The nobles might not bother with formal duels. They have servants and guards for that. A spilled drink on a noble could quickly turn into a brutal beating, or a trip to the stocks. The rigid social order didn't forgive mistakes lightly, especially when the mistake involved something as sacred as a feast. Feasts weren't just for eating. They were performances of power. Every gesture, from how you lifted your cup to where you sat, sent messages. Spilling wine was like shouting, "I disrespect you," across the hall. whether you meant it or not. Nobles took these messages seriously because their entire lives depended on status and alliances. Imagine the feast hall, long wooden tables groaning under heavy platters, flickering candlelight casting shadows on richly decorated tapestries. Lords and ladies dressed in silks and furs, their faces painted with pride and suspicion. The slightest slip, a spilled cup, a dropped knife, a poorly timed word, could spiral into chaos. And the wine itself wasn't always forgiving. Unlike today's carefully crafted vintages, medieval wine was often harsh, sour, or even cloudy, with bits of sediment floating like tiny invaders. Staining your clothing with this dark, smelly liquid was like branding yourself as clumsy or disrespectful. If you happened to spill on a lord or a lady, you might be expected to pay for the cleaning. If cleaning even meant anything in an age before modern detergents. Or worse, you might owe a replacement garment, which could cost a fortune. If you couldn't pay, you could lose your place at court or your job entirely. The stakes were high. Every action was a gamble with your survival and social standing on the line. The feast was a minefield, and you were the unwitting pedestrian stepping on unstable ground. But it wasn't just about spilled wine. The whole feast was a delicate balance of etiquette and tension. Who poured your drink? Who got to speak to whom? Who was allowed to sit where? Every detail was governed by unspoken rules that could ruin your reputation faster than any spilled cup. You might think, well, it's just a party. Why take it so seriously? But in medieval times, the party was the event. Nobles solidified alliances, commoners sought favor, and everyone tried to climb the social ladder. Sometimes by charming a lord's daughter, sometimes by making an enemy spill their wine. There are tales of guests who accidentally insulted a noble by failing to toast properly, or using the wrong hand to hold their cup. These minor blunders often ended with cold shoulders or whispered rumors that followed a person for years. A spilled drink was just one of many potential social landmines. And then there were the professional duelists, the men who made a living settling disputes with swords. If you spilled on someone with a quick temper and a sharp blade, you might not even get a chance to apologize before being dragged outside. Honor was defended with steel, not words. But the threat of violence didn't stop the wine from flowing or the feasts from happening. People drank to excess, to dull nerves, to celebrate, and sometimes to make bold political moves. That wine was both a blessing and a curse. It lubricated conversation, but also loosened tongues, leading to gossip, insults, and yes, spilled cups. You might ask, couldn't they just clean up the mess and move on? The answer is yes, but the real problem was the symbolism. A clean cup was a sign of respect. A stained cup, or worse, stained clothing, was a mark of disrespect. Medieval people were experts at reading these signs. If you were lucky, the spilled wine might be seen as an honest accident. But luck was rare. More often, people saw it as an insult or even an attack. Feuds sparked over less. Guests kept their eyes on each other like hawks, looking for any sign of weakness or disrespect. So, next time you imagine yourself at a medieval feast, remember this. One wrong move, one spilled cup, could be your last. You might think it's just wine, but in the medieval world, it's a weapon. One that could cost you your dignity, your safety, or even your life. As the feast rages on, the goblets keep clinking, the roasted meats keep disappearing, and the delicate balance of honor teeters on a knife's edge. So keep your elbows in, your hands steady, and your wits about you. Because if you spill wine on the wrong person, you might die. You've somehow survived the brutal medieval feast so far. You've been elbowed by drunks, waded through the stench of unwashed bodies, and dodged a few thrown bones. Now, the music starts. The fiddles squeal, and the pipes drone. Time to dance. Or at least try. And no, this is not a friendly village jig. This is the medieval version of social Russian roulette. One misstep, and your career, reputation, and perhaps your very place at court could be in ruins before you can say, Lord's foot. Dancing at a medieval feast was never just about having fun. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle, a kind of social audition. You're not just moving your feet, you're broadcasting your status, your manners, your nobility, or lack thereof, to everyone who matters. The lord or lady of the manor is watching, the other nobles are watching, even the servants and jesters are watching, and you better believe they're all judging, and they have long memories. If you're a noble, you're expected to be polished, graceful, and well-rehearsed. The dance floor is your stage, and every twirl or bow is a performance. To mess it up is to humiliate yourself in front of the most powerful people you'll ever meet. For commoners who somehow stumbled into a feast or low-ranking guests, attempting to join in could be even more disastrous. You'll be laughed at, pointed at, or worse, shunned from the next invitation. Now, imagine you step onto the rough wooden floor of the hall. It's uneven, sticky with spilled ale, and who knows what else. The musicians launch into a lively tune, a pavane or galliard perhaps, the music slicing through the thick air of sweat and smoke. Your shoes are hard leather, no fancy slippers here, and your feet ache from standing in the same stiff boots all day. You try to remember the complicated steps you've practiced in secret, but the pressure is suffocating. Your heart pounds not just from the movement, but from knowing every eye is locked on you, waiting for you to mess up. And you do. Your feet trip on a loose floorboard. You stumble awkwardly and try to catch yourself, but your partner's expression hardens. An unspoken, "What a fool." The room hushes for a moment. You feel your cheeks burn with embarrassment, but the music never stops. The dance continues as if nothing happened, but now everyone knows you aren't a natural. You are that awkward dancer. Your social stock plummets in seconds. In this world, where reputation is everything, this moment will haunt you for months. You'll hear whispers behind your back and notice glances dripping with pity or disdain. For nobles, dance training started young. Pages and squires were taught the proper moves, posture, and how to engage with various partners without embarrassing themselves or others. Dancing was a demonstration of control, discipline, and, most importantly, respect for the social order. Each step symbolized your place in the hierarchy. If you danced too boldly or too timidly, you risked offending powerful figures. Dance was diplomacy, writ in footwork. You may think, how hard can it be to dance? But medieval dances were no simple two-step. They had precise sequences, strict formations, and often required partners to intertwine and untangle in complicated patterns. The pavane was slow and stately, a kind of grand procession where every move was deliberate and dignified. The galliard was quick and lively, full of leaps and kicks that tested your stamina and balance. There were also branlés and courantes, all with their own rules and expectations. If you showed up without any idea of these dances, perhaps you were a newly arrived noble or a merchant invited out of courtesy, you were doomed. The crowd would spot your ignorance immediately. You'd be called clumsy, uncultured, and worse. Even the smallest mistake could be used as gossip ammunition. Did you see how Lord So-and-so almost crushed Lady Marigold's foot? And his timing was worse than a drunken miller. The rumor mill could turn a minor misstep into a full-blown scandal. But it wasn't just about grace or rhythm. The dance floor was a minefield of political intrigue. Your choice of partner was scrutinized like a royal decree. Who you danced with said volumes. Dancing with a powerful lord's daughter could be a bold move, signaling alliance or ambition. Refusing to dance with a particular noble could insult them deeply. Invitations to dance were not casual gestures. They were social contracts, opportunities to cement loyalties or betray friendships. Sometimes, the lord of the feast himself would demand a dance, and refusal was not an option. Imagine the humiliation if you bowed out or tripped in front of him. You'd be branded disrespectful, or worse. You could find yourself on the receiving end of whispered threats or cold shoulders in the halls thereafter. And because medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, a ruined reputation was often a fate worse than poverty. There were ways to minimize disaster. Nobles would sometimes practice hours alone or with trusted dance masters who specialized in courtly behavior. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was a tool for social control. A slow song could stretch out a tense moment, while a lively tune could give a charming dancer an edge. Meanwhile, those less fortunate learned by watching others, absorbing the unspoken rules like awkward apprentices in a cruel school. For the poor or less skilled, dancing could feel like a trap. You might be pushed into the center of the hall by over-enthusiastic hosts, or mocked if you resisted. And in the crush of bodies and candlelight, it was easy to be jostled, stepped on, or tangled up in a scandalous misunderstanding. Someone's sleeve could be ripped, a jewel knocked loose, or an insult misheard and repeated. All of these tiny disasters piled up into a social death sentence. And don't forget the clothes. You had to dance in your best finery, which was often stiff, heavy, and designed to impress, not move gracefully in. Imagine trying to whirl in a gown that weighs as much as a sack of flour, or leather boots that squeak and bind your feet, and the dirt and spilled ale on the floor made every step a gamble. When dancing was done, you might think you've escaped unscathed, but the real judgment came later. Quiet murmurs in dark corners, sidelong glances during meals, and maybe an unexpected cold shoulder or two in the weeks following the feast. Your social survival depended on how well you navigated this perilous ritual. So yes, dancing was a trap. It looked like merriment, but it was really a test, a challenge, and sometimes a public execution of your dignity. For every gracious lord who glided across the floor like a swan, there were dozens of others who stumbled, blushed, and prayed. No one remembered their names. And in a world where a single misstep could cost you a fortune, a marriage, or even your life, the dance floor was not a place to enjoy yourself. It was a battlefield, disguised in music and laughter. You're hungry, you're excited, and the smell, well, it's something all right. But here's the thing. The moment you take that first bite, you're rolling the dice. Because food poisoning, it was not just a possibility in medieval Europe. It was a guaranteed guest at every feast, and it was far less polite than the jesters. Let's start with hygiene. If you're picturing a spotless kitchen where cooks wash their hands before handling your food, you're living in a very different world. In 1325, the word clean had a very loose definition. Soap, mostly made from animal fat and ashes and used sparingly. Water, often stagnant, muddy, or worse, coming from a well everyone in the village had dipped into for days. The kitchen staff, a motley crew of overworked servants, butchers, and cooks who'd been handling raw meat, picking through the entrails of the day's slaughter. And yes, probably ignoring the odd rat or two scampering through the open door. Now, imagine this. The same knives you use to carve a roast pig are also cutting through feet of stale bread and a pile of fruits that have been sitting out for who knows how long. No refrigerators, no clean countertops, just wooden boards stained with old blood and grime, and probably more than a few unidentified stains that nobody asks questions about. The result? Cross-contamination was as common as bad jokes from the court fool. Preserving food was another tricky business. Because no medieval cook had the luxury of refrigeration, everything was either eaten immediately, salted heavily, smoked, or buried in ash or honey. Salt was a precious commodity, and if your lord was cheap, there was barely enough to stop the meat from rotting, but not enough to kill all the bacteria. Smoked meats hung near the fire, slowly drying, but still not immune to the relentless march of decay. And pies. Oh, the pies. Those sealed, pastry-covered mysteries were often filled with a slurry of whatever was on hand. Sometimes that meant fresh meat. Sometimes it meant the leftovers that were too risky to serve on their own. So what happens when you combine questionable hygiene, questionable preservation, and the medieval equivalent of food experiments? You get feasts where half the guests ended up doubled over by the next morning. Sometimes worse. Food poisoning wasn't just a vague fear. It was an everyday hazard. Historians have dug through letters, court records, and even medical treatises from the time, uncovering complaints about violent sickness following lavish dinners. People talked about the flux, a gruesome term for diarrhea, so severe it left victims weak and pale as ghosts. Some records even mention outbreaks of pestilence from the stomach that swept through noble households after a single feast, taking down entire families and their guests. What made it worse was that the symptoms were terrifying. Medieval medicine was mostly guesswork, backed by superstition and the occasional herbal remedy. If you were unlucky enough to get poisoned, you might suffer from violent vomiting, uncontrollable diarrhea, crippling cramps, and a fever that made your skin crawl. The idea of calling a doctor was laughable. Medical professionals were scarce, expensive, and often believed to be witches or charlatans. So people suffered in silence, or relied on prayers and strange concoctions made from herbs, animal parts, or even crushed pearls. One particularly nasty culprit was something we now call botulism, a type of poisoning from improperly stored meat or fish. It was invisible to the medieval eye, but deadly as all hell. Another common offender was salmonella, hiding in the uncooked eggs or undercooked poultry served at the feast. And then there was E. coli, lurking in the water used to wash the vegetables, or in the ale that had been left uncovered overnight, attracting flies, and who knows what else. Speaking of flies, feast halls were buzzing, crawling, and swarming with them. Flies didn't just annoy diners, they were perfect vectors for spreading disease. They landed on rotting scraps, smeared themselves in feces, then flitted over to your food, dropping bacteria like confetti at a terrible party. Trying to swat them away while holding a goblet of ale was a lost cause. Better to just learn to ignore the buzzing death squadron overhead. And if you think hand washing would save you, think again. It was rare for anyone to wash their hands between tasks, and those who did usually just dipped them quickly in cold water. No soap, no scrubbing, and certainly no sanitizers. So those greasy fingers passing meat around the table were spreading more than just good cheer. Of course, the cooks themselves often got sick, but their work was relentless. Preparing a feast for hundreds meant handling enormous quantities of food in cramped, hot kitchens where hygiene was impossible. If a cook got ill, it didn't mean the kitchen shut down. It meant they passed on their germs and mistakes to the next unfortunate soul tasked with chopping, seasoning, or stirring. And you might wonder, what about the water? Well, clean drinking water was as rare as a quiet day in the castle. Everyone drank ale or wine because water was a known carrier of disease. That meant food was often cooked or washed in questionable water, adding to the risk. Some lucky feast-goers might have survived the evening without immediate sickness, but the delayed symptoms were another trap. Food poisoning often struck hours or even days later, so the person who looked perfectly fine while raising their goblet might be found dead or bedridden by sunrise. Imagine a noble who just polished off a hearty pie and washed it down with ale. 2 days later, they're writhing in agony, feverish and unable to rise. Their guests whisper of curses or poison, but in truth, it's the invisible enemy of bacteria that feasted on them first. And let's not forget that poor peasants or servants who cleared the table. They ate leftovers, often cold, greasy, and half-spoiled. Many of them ended up sick, weaker, and sometimes dead. Because in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't guaranteed by a hospital bed or antibiotics, but by sheer luck and a strong constitution. Still, feasts were essential social occasions. People risked their lives for food, for favor, and for the chance to rise a notch in society. But the cost was high. Food poisoning was the uninvited, deadly guest no one wanted, but everyone knew was coming. So next time you complain about your food delivery taking an extra 10 minutes or your milk going bad in the fridge, remember, medieval feasts might look glorious, but behind the pomp and splendor was a nightmare of spoiled meat, unwashed hands, and deadly germs. You'd regret going, not just because of the smells or the chaos, but because you might not make it through the night. Bon appetit? More like bon chance. Now, just when you think you can slip out quietly, maybe duck into the shadows and escape back to your dank hut, think again. Leaving early? Forget it. That's not how medieval feasting worked. In fact, if you even thought about making a quick exit, you were already committing a social sin worse than spilling your drink on a duke. Medieval etiquette was a ruthless beast, and the rules about leaving a feast could ruin your day, your reputation, or in some cases, your life. First off, no one left the feast whenever they felt like it. The idea of popping out early was as foreign as forks at the table. When you were invited, and trust me, getting invited was a whole other battlefield. You were expected to stay until the hosts, often powerful nobles, officially dismissed the guests. Think of it like the medieval version of the party's not over until the king says so. Except replace the party with hours of hard drinking, questionable food, and endless small talk. Why? Because the feast wasn't just about filling bellies. It was a carefully choreographed dance of power, politics, and prestige. Leaving early was like stepping out of the dance, mid-step, refusing to play your part. It was an insult, a sign of disrespect, and a signal you didn't value the host or the other guests enough to stay. This could cause offense that lasted long after the last morsel was eaten. Imagine you're at the grand hall. The fire crackles, the musicians strum their lutes, and the air is thick with the scent of roasted meat, spilled ale, and, well, sweat. The lord of the manor watches, eyes sharp, ready to note who's paying attention and who's itching to leave. You glance at the heavy wooden door, imagining the cold air outside, the freedom. But the moment you try to sneak out, a servant or worse, a guard, intercepts you with a sharp word or a pointed look. No exit for you, at least not yet. This wasn't just about manners. Staying was a test of loyalty and endurance. Did you have the stamina to endure the endless rounds of drinking? Could you hold your tongue during delicate political talks? Would you remain upright through hours of dancing, singing, and endless compliments? If you failed, you risked being labeled a weakling, a troublemaker, or worse, a traitor. Leaving early could also be dangerous. Remember, medieval politics were brutal. Offending your host by leaving prematurely might provoke a furious response. At best, you'd be ignored in future invitations. At worst, you might find yourself excluded from alliances, denied favors, or even publicly humiliated. Yes, some lords used feasts as a stage to publicly shame those who disrespected them. Imagine being dragged back from the door, forced to apologize before the whole court. That was your medieval nightmare. And it didn't stop at the lord's household. The entire village or town might gossip about your early exit. Feasts were major social events, often the only chance for peasants, merchants, knights, and nobles to mingle. Leaving before the grand finale was like telling everyone you had better things to do, which was rarely true. Your reputation would suffer. You'd be the subject of whispered rumors. Did you see how Sir Godfrey left before the toast? What a coward! Or, Lady Agnes was gone before the third course. Surely she has secrets. If you really needed to leave, you'd have to request permission, but that was tricky. The hosts weren't known for their generosity with such requests, especially if you were a guest of lesser rank. Saying, "I have to go," was often met with a polite but firm, "Stay and enjoy the company." Refusing meant risking offense. Pushing too hard could lead to outright conflict. And let's be honest, you probably didn't want to leave anyway. Medieval feasts were exhausting marathons of standing, sitting, eating, drinking, and performing. The last thing you'd want was to admit defeat by walking away early, especially when the lords were watching, judging every move. What if you tried to sneak out after the feast officially ended? The hall might empty, but the courtyard and chambers often filled with lingering guests looking for private conversations, deals, or the occasional backstab, both figuratively and literally. Leaving too soon could mean missing vital opportunities or angering powerful allies. Even worse, if you were a noble or knight, your obligations extended beyond just staying. You might be expected to escort the host to their chambers, to sing a final song, or to share in the last cup of ale, which was less about drinking and more about bonding and showing solidarity. Declining these rituals was almost sacrilegious. And if you think this only applied to the elite, think again. Even peasants working the feast were bound by the rigid social script. Helping clear tables, serving drinks, or entertaining guests until the host finally said the feast was over. There was no clock to punch out early. The work was grueling, relentless, and public. The worst part? The longer you stayed, the more you risked exhaustion, overindulgence, and social blunders. But leaving early was far worse. So you sat, sweating in your wool tunic, knees aching, stomach stretched from the feast, and head swimming from ale, hoping you didn't say the wrong thing or spill the wrong drink. All the while, your mind whispered about the cold bed waiting at home, but your body remained glued to the wooden bench. Because in the end, the feast was a test of patience, endurance, and political savvy. Leaving was more than an exit. It was a statement. And in medieval times, statements were dangerous. So next time you find yourself craving a quick escape from a party or a dinner, spare a thought for the medieval guest who couldn't leave when they wanted, who had to sit, smile, and survive hours of awkward conversation, suspicious food, and the ever-watchful eyes of nobles who held their futures in a grip as tight as their mead cups. You might think you have social obligations today, but at least you're free to leave the room when you want. In 1325? Not so much. You've survived the medieval feast, barely. You've eaten questionable meat, smelled things that modern noses can't even imagine, and maybe even managed to keep your wits about you in the chaos of medieval revelry. But now, let's talk about the real danger lurking beneath all the ale-soaked laughter and roasted boar. The stocks. Yes, the stocks. That lovely wooden torture device designed to publicly humiliate you, immobilize you, and make sure everyone in town remembers your name, for all the wrong reasons. Because if you think a medieval feast was just about stuffing yourself until you explode and dancing like a fool, think again. The moment you let your guard down, whether by slurring your speech after one too many flagons, insulting the wrong lord, or simply losing control of your manners, you risked being dragged out of the hall and dumped, head and hands locked in a humiliating wooden frame, in the town square for all to mock. Let's paint the picture. You're drunk. Naturally, it's medieval Europe. Ale is cheaper and safer than water, so everyone's got a tankard glued to their hand. Maybe you overdid it on the mead, or you thought it was a brilliant idea to challenge the Lord's favorite knight to a drinking contest. Spoiler, it wasn't. You're stumbling over your own feet, barely able to string words together without insulting someone important. And then, bam, you hear it. The clang of the bailiff's iron chain rattling through the hall. Before you can say, pottage, two burly men have you by the arms. The crowd gasps. The feast halts. All eyes fix on you as they march you to the stocks, dragging you through the muddy courtyard to the center of town. You're the entertainment now. Stocks were the medieval version of social media humiliation, except way worse and a lot more painful. The stocks were a wooden frame, just tall enough to trap your ankles, sometimes wrists and neck too. You're forced to sit or stand, immobile, exposed to the elements, passers-by, and the relentless insults of your neighbors. Your fate, hours, maybe days, locked in place, sometimes even longer if your offense was particularly scandalous. What could land you here, you ask? Well, let's start with public drunkenness. Medieval society had zero tolerance for losing control in public, especially when it involved excess alcohol. Sure, everyone drank, but only the right people knew their limits. If you were a noble, you were expected to maintain a decorum befitting your rank, no matter how many flagons you drained. If you were a peasant, well, you were supposed to be sober enough to work the next day. If you failed, you were a public disgrace. Lewd behavior was another guaranteed ticket to the stocks. That means no grabbing the serving wenches behind, no making inappropriate jokes about the Lord's family, and absolutely no public displays of affection beyond a polite bow or curtsy. Medieval morality was harsh, and feasts were closely watched. Everyone knew the rules, even if they chose to ignore them. Insulting a noble? Oh, that was the quickest route to a wooden cage. Nobles were the medieval version of untouchable celebrities, surrounded by entourages and bodyguards. Say the wrong thing, make a joke at their expense, or, heaven forbid, call one of them out on their terrible fashion choices, and you might just find yourself hoisted by your ankles and displayed for a week. And don't think you'll get any sympathy. The crowd loved watching the fall of a fool. The stocks weren't just about punishment. They were a tool of social control. Medieval lords and officials used public shaming to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. The spectacle was designed to keep peasants in line and nobles in check. It was a warning. Misbehave, and your dignity will be stripped away in front of your entire village. Now, you might be thinking, surely this punishment was quick and painless? Nope. The stocks were medieval torture, disguised as public humiliation. Imagine sitting with your legs cramped, hands locked, exposed to whatever weather nature could throw at you. Summer sun blazing down, turning your legs to hot coals, or winter frost biting at your skin until your fingers go numb. Rain? You're soaked and miserable. Snow? You're shivering and miserable. And throughout it all, the townsfolk, friends, enemies, and strangers alike, would throw rotten vegetables, mud, and the occasional insult your way. The smell alone was enough to make your head spin. And speaking of smells, it wasn't just the town's cast-offs that assaulted your senses. There was always the stench of animal manure from nearby streets, the unwashed bodies of spectators, and the inevitable whiff of chamber pots spilled on the cobblestones. Your prison might have been wooden, but the experience was anything but refined. If you thought the physical discomfort was bad, the social consequences were worse. Your neighbors would whisper behind your back for months, "There goes the drunk who insulted Lord Geoffrey." Or, "Remember when Edith tried to dance on the table and lost her skirts?" The stocks branded you as a fool, a troublemaker, or worse, a danger to the social order. Your chances of marriage, business, or even simple respect evaporated like morning mist. Sometimes the punishment wasn't limited to the stocks. The most notorious offenders might be whipped, fined, or even thrown into the dungeon. And let's be honest, a dungeon cell was a vacation compared to standing in the stocks all day while your every humiliation was on display. But here's the kicker. The stocks could be used as entertainment, too. At fairs and feasts, townsfolk gathered around the stocks, not just to jeer, but to gamble on how long the prisoner would last, or who would throw the biggest mud pie. Kids used the time to perfect their rotten tomato throwing skills. So if you ever find yourself in the stocks, your suffering will double as the town's prime source of amusement. And yet, despite all this, the medieval feast was a place of risk and reward. The stakes were high. One wrong word, one ill-timed joke, or one spilled cup of ale could mean a night in the stocks, or worse. The feast was no casual dinner party. It was a social battlefield where your survival depended on wit, restraint, and a hefty dose of luck. So next time you imagine medieval feasts as cozy gatherings with hearty food and good company, remember this. You could just as easily end up locked in a humiliating wooden cage, a spectacle for the entire village to mock, while the town crier announces your downfall. In other words, medieval feasts were equal parts feast and farce, with a heavy side of public punishment. Because you're not just going to a party, you're also walking into a trap. Not the kind with spikes and swinging axes, though honestly that might be preferable. This is the financial kind, the political kind, the kind where you leave smiling, but somehow poorer, more obligated, and now dangerously indebted to a man who owns 3 villages, and a private hangman. The feast is bait. You are the fish. And tonight, the hook is served in gravy. Let's begin with the setup. As soon as you walk into the hall, you notice something's off. Sure, there's the roasted boar, the jugs of ale, the bard singing something vaguely insulting to the French. But the host? He's all grins. Too many grins. He's not drinking. He's watching, like a spider with a meat platter. And you, dear guest, are being fattened up for something. Maybe it's a harmless donation. A new chapel needs funding. Or the local levy is being raised. Or perhaps there's a war brewing. And funny enough, your name just came up. Oh no, not to fight, of course. Just to contribute. You know, horses, sacks of grain, a few able-bodied sons. Nothing major. Pass the bread. The whole evening is a delicate dance of manipulation. The noble leans over during the venison course and chuckles. You've done well for yourself this year, haven't you? That's not small talk. That's an opening gambit. He doesn't care how your turnip harvest went. He's laying groundwork. The next course is guilt, garnished with expectations. You laugh, nervously. You sip your wine and try not to spill it on your borrowed cloak. You nod and mutter something humble. Too humble? You might have just volunteered for rebuilding the granary. Then, there are the favors. Oh, the favors. Feasts are the medieval version of LinkedIn. Nobles use them to test loyalty, forge alliances, and squeeze promises like blood from a particularly well-fed turnip. Your host might mention how he's short on guards, or how the miller in the next village is causing trouble. Would you have a word with him? He asks, pouring you more wine. He doesn't want a word. He wants a solution. He wants you to handle it. And the more you eat, the more you drink, the more you nod like a nervous chicken. Well, the more you're agreeing to things you don't even understand. And here's the worst part. Saying no is nearly impossible. Not because you're gagged with venison, though that happens too, but because saying no at a feast is social suicide. These events are public theater. Everyone's watching. The other guests? The steward. The cook who hates you. If a noble asks for help and you hesitate, boom, you're the ungrateful swine who drank his wine and spat in his stew. Your reputation is toast, and not the warm, buttered kind. It gets worse if you're someone with a coin, a merchant, say, or a miller with a suspiciously well-built house. Nobles see that and think, revenue stream. They don't say, tax. Oh no, they say things like contribution to the realm or mutual obligation. Sometimes they make you a sheriff. Sounds fancy, right? Until you realize it means funding your own guards, repairing roads with your own timber, and being blamed when everything goes wrong. And don't even try to weasel out. You can't. There's no polite excuse to skip a feast, and once you're there, you're in it. Like a roast goose on a silver platter. You smile, you eat, you agree, and you pay. Even the gifts you give are traps. You think offering a few bottles of imported wine will earn goodwill? Maybe. Or maybe it tells your host you're too wealthy. Now you've just volunteered to supply the next crusade. All because you brought Bordeaux. Oh, and don't expect to see your gifts again. They're now part of the noble's display, right next to the tapestry you helped pay for and the goblet he insists you try, which just so happens to match the set your cousin lost last winter. And if you happen to be lower on the social ladder, say a lesser knight or a skilled artisan, you're not safe either. Your presence might be rewarded with new responsibilities. You might be granted land, which sounds lovely until you realize it's swampy, full of wolves, and taxed like it's Paris. Even flattery isn't safe. Compliment the noble's hunting dogs? Congratulations, you're now expected to breed a litter for him next spring. Mention how fine the tapestry looks? Good news, your wife's been commissioned to embroider his family crest. For free. So you sit there, chewing your mutton, trying to smile while silently calculating how much this feast is going to cost you. Not just in coin, but in hours, in favors, in obligations you never meant to agree to. You laugh at the jester's jokes. You nod at the bishop's sermon. You pretend to enjoy the boiled eel. And when it's over, and you stagger out into the freezing night, stuffed with meat and dread, your purse a little lighter, and your soul a little heavier, you realize the awful truth. You weren't a guest. You were the entertainment, the wallet, the pawn, and you'll be paying for this generosity until the next feast, or the next war, whichever comes first. You survived the feast. You didn't die of food poisoning, choke on a pheasant bone, or offend a duke with your peasanty table manners. But don't get smug, because now comes the part they never warn you about, the morning after. The sun rises like a hammer to the skull. You wake up somewhere between a wine barrel and a heap of half-chewed mutton bones, your head pounding like a cathedral bell being beaten by an angry monk. Your mouth is drier than the Pope's sense of humor, and your tongue feels like it was used to polish chainmail. You drank too much, ate too much, laughed too much at the Lord's nephew when he tripped into the gravy boat. And now your body is staging a full-blown rebellion. Congratulations, you're hungover in the most miserable century imaginable. There's no aspirin, no greasy breakfast sandwich, no dark, quiet room with blackout curtains and Netflix, just a freezing stone floor, a spinning ceiling, and the distant sound of pigs rooting through last night's leftovers. The air smells like old wine, sweat, wax, spoiled fish, and defeat. Welcome to the day after a medieval feast, where regrets are plenty and water is suspicious. If you're a noble, things are slightly less horrifying. You might wake up in a bed, if you're lucky, though the mattress is still just a lumpy sack of straw covered in a crusty wool blanket that now carries the aroma of duck fat and spilled ale. You ring for a servant, but they're nowhere to be found, because they're downstairs, scraping vomit off the flagstones with a wooden spatula and trying not to cry. Let's talk about those servants, because if you thought last night was hard on your guts, imagine being the poor soul cleaning up the aftermath. The feast hall, which last night glittered with candles and laughter, now looks like the losing side of a battlefield. Crushed pies, chicken bones, overturned trenchers, wine stains, and something you hope is pudding, but might be something worse, are smeared across the long wooden tables and all over the rushes on the floor. You know, the rushes that were supposed to soak up spills and hide the dirt? Yeah, they've done their job. Now they smell like Satan's compost pile. Someone knocked over the chamber pot. Someone else thought it was funny to throw eel skins at the minstrel. The hounds, who were meant to clean up under the tables, are drunk off mead-soaked scraps and now snoring loudly in the corner, bellies bloated and legs twitching, and the smell, oh, the smell, is not just unholy. It's a crime against nostrils. The roast boar that wowed the guests last night is now curling at the edges, flies doing slow laps around its glazed head. Leftover stews congeal in cracked pots. The bread trencher you used as a plate is now stiff enough to be used as a bludgeon. No one's eating any of this. Not even the rats. Not yet, anyway. Give them time. Back to you. You try to sit up. Bad idea. Your stomach rolls like a ship in a storm and your head threatens to detach from your shoulders. Someone in the corner groans. Is that a squire? A cousin? A noble who drank himself into a coma? Who knows? You all look equally awful. Your tunic is stained, your shoes are missing, and your dignity left some time between the fourth jug of cider and the interpretive dancing. And the worst part? It's not over. No, because breakfast is expected. A proper host offers something to soak up the sins of the night before. Usually, this means reheated pottage, last night's food boiled down into something that might have once been vegetables, but now resembles beige sludge. You force yourself to eat it, because refusing would be rude, and being rude gets remembered. Everything gets remembered. The servants, bless their broken souls, bring out jugs of watered-down ale and hard bread. Some people nibble politely. Others retch quietly behind tapestries. You don't speak unless spoken to. Your voice is hoarse from shouting over music, and your throat is raw from the smoke of too many torches and hearth fires. There's no mouthwash, of course. You chew on mint leaves if you're lucky, or just live with the fact that your breath could wilt ivy. But wait, there's more. Because now someone, probably the host, wants to relive the highlights. The way Lady Marjorie danced with the goose, the moment Sir Ulrich tried to kiss the bishop's ring and missed by 3 feet. The time you knocked over a flagon and blamed the dog. Everyone laughs, but it's the kind of laughter that means we will never let you live this down. Cleanup continues all day. The hall must be swept, the platters scrubbed, the floor re-rushed. Wax must be scraped off benches. Pewter goblets must be polished. Servants who survived the kitchen firestorm now face the aftermath. One slips on a gravy smear, and goes down hard. Another vomits quietly into a bucket. The dogs wake up, bark at nothing, and promptly vomit too. By afternoon, the feast hall begins to look slightly less cursed. The stench has lessened from unbearable to merely offensive, but you can still smell it in your hair, your clothes, your skin. It follows you like a guilty conscience. You think about bathing, but that's only for saints and royalty. So you settle for wiping yourself down with a cold cloth and praying to St. Apollonia that no one important noticed your hiccuping attempt at courtly poetry. Eventually, you stagger out into the daylight. Your eyes squint. The birds are chirping. The pigs are snuffling around the refuse pile. And you, brave soul, are alive. But as you limp toward your cold, bug-infested bed, stomach unsettled and soul slightly fractured, you realize something profound. You would not survive another feast. Thanks for listening. If you're already asleep, great. We've successfully lulled you to sleep. And if you're still awake, well, that's impressive. If you genuinely enjoy these boring stories about history, feel free to subscribe to our channel whenever you're in the mood. Sleep well, and good night.